The tension in the hearing room was already simmering when Pam Bondi arrived. The air was heavy with expectation, as cameras adjusted their focus and reporters sharpened their pens. Everyone in the chamber knew that something was coming, but no one could have predicted how fast it would spiral. At the center of it all was a leaked document, a confidential memo authored by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett weeks earlier. It had only surfaced the night before, and its contents had spread like wildfire through the corridors of Capitol Hill. According to the memo, Crockett had allegedly advised members of her inner circle to publicly question the legitimacy of recent federal investigations into politically charged incidents involving sabotage at high-profile corporate sites, including a Tesla research facility. While the memo didn't directly encourage violence, it insinuated that public sentiment needed to be redirected toward protest and unrest, hinting at a larger ideological shift. Though she claimed her words had been distorted, the timing was damaging, especially given the spike in politically motivated attacks in recent months. Pam Bondi entered the hearing with a confidence that cut through the atmosphere. Her team had spent the last 24 hours piecing together a damning timeline, one that painted Crockett as reckless and manipulative in how she wielded her influence. Crockett, for her part, remained poised but visibly defensive. Her usual composure was tinged with an undercurrent of agitation, a readiness to fight not just to clear her name, but to reassert her position as a fearless voice against unchecked power. As the hearing began, Bondi wasted no time. She laid out a timeline of events that coincided suspiciously with Crockett's memo. She referenced specific quotes, moments where public statements had stirred unrest, protests that had spiraled into violence, and social media posts that called for action against powerful figures. While she never outright accused Crockett of orchestrating anything, she built a framework that suggested a dangerous level of negligence. Crockett responded with sharp eyes and clipped words, immediately rejecting the narrative as a smear campaign, orchestrated by those threatened by dissent. Her voice, though steady, grew colder with each passing minute. She argued that Bondi was twisting her intentions, weaponizing context, and exploiting tragedy for political gain. But Bondi didn't back down. With every rebuttal, she peeled back another layer of Crockett's public image, revealing contradictions and inconsistencies that left the room teetering on the edge of eruption. The audience, which had begun the hearing in respectful silence, slowly started murmuring. Some visibly nodded along with Bondi's accusations, while others looked to Crockett with sympathy, seeing in her the familiar posture of a woman being cornered. When Crockett pivoted the conversation to Elon Musk and the concentration of power among tech elites, it was clear she was attempting to reframe the issue, shifting from personal blame to systemic critique. Bondi, however, refused to let her off the hook. As each woman sharpened her stance, the energy in the room shifted from procedural to combustible. No longer was this a mere policy discussion. It had become personal. It had become about who could withstand scrutiny and who would be forced to bear the weight of their words. Just as Crockett raised her voice to defend her right to challenge billionaires and their influence on democracy, Bondi slammed her hand on the desk, not in theatrics, but to cut through the noise. That single act silenced the room. Crockett froze, her glare locked on Bondi. It was the kind of silence that came before something irreversible. And in that silence, Bondi issued a chilling warning. She described a mother who had lost her son when he was caught in the crossfire of a protest gone violent, a protest sparked by rhetoric that bore uncanny similarities to what Crockett had endorsed in her leaked memo. That moment pierced through the chamber like ice, and for a brief second even Crockett looked shaken. But she didn't retreat. Instead, her response was immediate, visceral. Her chair slid back slightly as she leaned forward, her hands gripped the table and her breathing shifted. It wasn't fear, it was fury. And just like that, the confrontation began to slip beyond the grasp of formality. The sound of Crockett's chair dragging against the polished floor echoed louder than it should have, punctuating a shift in tone that everyone in the hearing room felt. Gone was the Congresswoman's strategic reserve, replaced by a growing storm of indignation. Her eyes no longer scanned the room with calculated calm. They locked onto Pam Bondi with unmistakable intensity. Whatever lines of civility had been holding the moment together began to fray. Pam didn't flinch. In fact, she leaned in ever so slightly, calmly waiting as Crockett gathered herself into a wave of defiance. The Congresswoman launched into a fiery rebuttal, defending not just her memo, but her entire political philosophy. She spoke of years of systemic injustice, of people whose voices had been silenced or mocked by the very institutions Bondi now claimed to defend. Her words, though passionate, came jagged, colored by resentment, bruised by implication. She painted herself as a product of hard-earned struggle, someone who had not just earned her seat at the table, but had to fight to keep it every single day. But for every point she made, Bondi came back with cold precision, dismantling arguments without raising her voice. She reminded the room that political frustration, while valid, did not give anyone the license to fan the flames of civil unrest. She referenced one protest after another, comparing timestamps, quoting Crockett's posts, and tying it all together into a narrative of consequence. The pressure was mounting. Crockett's supporters in the room began to shift in their seats, agitated, some visibly angry. A few audience members exchanged glances, whispering behind their hands. Then, as Bondi presented a series of emails allegedly sent from Crockett's office to activist groups, urging them to intensify visibility campaigns, the energy snapped. Crockett's voice rose, louder than before, and her words stumbled over each other in anger. This wasn't just about damage control anymore. It was personal. She accused Bondi of orchestrating a political takedown, of using the pain of grieving families to score points. The calm structure of her argument shattered, and what remained was raw emotion, an eruption born from months of bottled tension, sharpened by humiliation, and now fully unleashed. Her voice cracked at one point, not from weakness but from the sheer force of it. A staffer tried to hand her a document mid-sentence, likely a strategy note, but Crockett waved it away with visible frustration. She was beyond planning. She was deep into the chaos now, too far out to retreat without consequence. She challenged Bondi's motivations, her background, her supposed moral high ground. She dug deep, invoking moments from Bondi's past cases, her affiliations, and even hinted at hypocrisy within Bondi's career. For a second, it looked as if the hearing would collapse into total disorder. The moderator called for calm, but no one was listening. The press gallery lit up, fingers flying across keyboards. On social media, clips were already circulating. The shot of Crockett standing, her hand raised as if demanding the room hear her out, was instantly viral. It was fury wrapped in eloquence, though to some it appeared unhinged, unprofessional. Pam Bondi remained eerily composed, letting Crockett burn through her fury. When the Congresswoman finally stopped, her chest rising and falling quickly, Pam slowly lifted a new file onto the table. Without saying a word, she opened it and began reading aloud. Not a memo this time, but a sworn statement from a whistleblower, someone who once worked on Crockett's communications team. The statement detailed the deliberate crafting of provocative messages designed to manipulate outrage, all coordinated, all premeditated. The effect was devastating. Crockett, still standing, now seemed frozen in place. Her lips parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came. Someone in the audience gasped. The room didn't erupt. It fell silent again, though this time it felt more like a collective holding of breath. Crockett's eyes darted toward her team seated behind her, searching for something. Reassurance. Direction. Maybe just a place to land. But all she saw were pale faces and stiff posture. Her allies looked shaken, not because they doubted her, but because the tide had turned. Even those who had come to support her now struggled to keep up with the momentum of the confrontation. The public outburst, combined with Bondi's surgical composure, had shifted the optics. Crockett had begun the hearing as a defender of free speech and grassroots power. Now, to some, she looked like a figure losing control. Her message was buried beneath a wave of emotion, while Bondi's case was stacking into something more formidable, more believable. And yet the fire wasn't extinguished. The hearing was far from over. Crockett adjusted her jacket, sat down slowly, and stared ahead, no longer speaking, but no less determined. She was bruised, but not broken. The storm was still alive behind her eyes, and the fight was not yet finished. Crockett sat motionless, her shoulders squared but her eyes distant, as if calculating how to take back the ground she had just lost. For a moment it seemed like the hearing would slide back into order, with questions returning to decorum and procedure. But the atmosphere had changed. The collision between Bondi's measured force and Crockett's emotional eruption had left the room charged, unsteady, and unpredictable. And then came the voice. From the audience gallery a man stood. His voice was quiet at first, cracking with hesitation, but it cut through the silence like thunder. The security team moved toward him instinctively, but the hearing moderator raised a hand, allowing him to speak. The man identified himself not as a politician or an activist, but as a brother to someone injured in a violent protest outside a tech conference just 3 months earlier. He spoke slowly, each word trembling under the weight of suppressed pain. His sister, he explained, had been caught in the chaos after demonstrators clashed with private security. The protest was organized within 48 hours of a series of inflammatory social media posts made by public figures, including Crockett. She had been standing outside a cafe when a flying glass bottle struck her head. She survived, but with permanent damage to her vision. The man's voice faltered as he described her struggle to adjust, her inability to work, and the way their family had been quietly torn apart. The room fell into a stunned silence, and all eyes turned to Crockett. She stared at the man without, blinking. Her face, just moments ago flushed with fire, had lost its color. Her hands were clenched on the table not in anger, but restraint. And as the man looked at her directly and said that while he did not believe she intended for violence to happen, she had helped create an atmosphere where it became inevitable. The last layer of her armor cracked. Bondi didn't gloat. She said nothing, did nothing. She allowed the man's words to settle, knowing they carried a moral weight no policy memo ever could. This wasn't political anymore. This was personal. Crockett tried to respond, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier bravado. She expressed sympathy, but there was no applause. The room wasn't interested in statements anymore. The air was too thick with consequence. For the first time, Crockett appeared uncertain, as if finally grappling with the human cost of her influence. Pam, sensing the shift, returned to her documents with calm intensity. She read from another witness statement, this one from a community leader who claimed Crockett's rhetoric had emboldened fringe elements to hijack legitimate protests. Not only were lives disrupted, but genuine grassroots movements were now viewed with suspicion because of the violence that followed. That distinction hit hard. It suggested that Crockett's words hadn't just hurt individuals, they had inadvertently harmed the very causes she claimed to champion. Crockett's defense was still there, buried under the weight of these revelations, but her energy had changed. She acknowledged the complexity of what had happened, yet refused to take full responsibility. She framed her intentions as noble, her anger as righteous. But now everything she said was measured, as if she had finally understood how dangerous unfiltered conviction could be when amplified to a national audience. Even those sympathetic to her cause could see the cracks. Crockett had always been a symbol of passionate resistance, but now she was staring down the cost of being heard too loudly, too carelessly. Her narrative was no longer solely about the oppressed versus the powerful. It was about accountability, about how even the voices of resistance can leave collateral damage when wielded without precision. Pam Bondi, ever methodical, pressed forward. Not with accusations, but with questions. Not just to Crockett, but to the chamber at large. What responsibility do public figures have when their words inspire action? At what point does influence become a weapon? And who bears the burden when good intentions become violent outcomes? Crockett answered with more humility now, though still not with full concession. She spoke of frustration, of years spent pushing against institutions that had never truly listened. She said she had tried to wake people up, not push them to violence. But the line between the two was now blurred beyond recognition. And in that moment, something changed. Crockett stopped trying to win. Instead, she began trying to understand. It wasn't a surrender, and it wasn't a collapse. It was the first sign of reflection. The fire in her eyes dimmed, not extinguished, but cooled, into something quieter, deeper. Bondi, seeing that shift, let the silence linger before moving to close her final remarks. But the hearing wasn't done yet. Just as it seemed the storm had passed, a previously unnoticed woman seated in the far back row stood up and made her way forward. Her expression unreadable, her movements deliberate. As she approached the podium, staffers exchanged confused glances. She hadn't been on the official speakers list. No one seemed to know who she was. The woman's heels clicked sharply against the floor as she walked toward the front of the room. Everything else went still. Even the moderator hesitated, uncertain whether to halt her or allow the moment to unfold. But there was something in her presence, in the quiet steadiness of her steps, that made resistance feel almost inappropriate. She wasn't there to cause chaos. She was carrying something heavier. Truth. When she finally reached the microphone, she introduced herself, softly. Her name, though unfamiliar to the national press, struck an immediate chord with one person in the room, Pam Bondi. For a flicker of a second, Pam's expression changed. Not enough for most to catch, but for those who had studied her for years, it was there. Recognition. The woman explained she had once been a legal clerk under Bondi during a pivotal case in Florida involving protest law years ago. At the time, she said, she had been an idealist, young, unshaken, believing in justice above all. But over the course of that case, she'd witnessed a strategy unfold from within Bondi's team that quietly stripped legal protections from demonstrators under the guise of maintaining public order. She didn't speak with venom, and she didn't accuse Pam of anything criminal. But she described the slow erosion of civil liberties, how protest organizers were surveilled, how their meetings were infiltrated, and how rhetoric was used to frame their peaceful movements as inherently dangerous. Bondi didn't interrupt. She didn't blink. But her silence now felt less like control and more like calculation. The room began to sway again, now seeing a mirror held up not just to Crockett but to Bondi as well. The woman spoke of how that experience changed her, how she left law altogether, how she'd spent years wrestling with the consequences of helping build a case that crippled activism in her state. She said the irony of watching this hearing unfold was too great to ignore, seeing two powerful women accuse each other of irresponsibility, while both, in their own ways, had played parts in escalating distrust and unrest across the nation. And then she said something neither woman expected. She told Crockett that although her words had lit dangerous fires, they had also lit torches in dark places, galvanizing marginalized communities who had long been ignored. And she told Bondi that while her calls for law and order resonated with those seeking safety, they had sometimes created a chilling effect on dissent that allowed deeper injustices to go unchallenged. In essence, both women were right, and both were wrong. The chamber fell into a hum of quiet reflection. No shouting, no arguments. The audience, which had swayed wildly over the course of the hearing, now seemed suspended in a rare moment of honesty. Crockett sat straighter now, not with arrogance but with clarity. Her anger was no longer aimed at Bondi. It had turned inward, tempered by recognition that influence, once granted, must be wielded with discipline. Her earlier defiance had been rooted in years of dismissal and disrespect, but now she could see how passion without focus could do as much harm as it aimed to heal. Pam Bondi, ever the enforcer, was less shaken than transformed. Her authority had remained intact, but her certainty had cracked. The testimony didn't undo the evidence she had presented, nor did it invalidate the grief she had brought forward on behalf of victims. But it reminded her, and everyone watching, that her pursuit of accountability was incomplete if it failed to examine her own legacy. What followed wasn't an apology. Neither woman was there to beg forgiveness. Instead, they exchanged a look, brief, tight, respectful, not friendly, not reconciled, but aware. The moderator, finally regaining control, moved to adjourn the session. But before the gavel struck, Crockett requested a final word. She didn't raise her voice, didn't pontificate. Instead, she acknowledged the man who had spoken earlier, about his sister. She thanked him for his honesty and vowed to meet with him privately. Whether she meant to offer support, restitution, or simply listen, no one knew. But the gesture landed. Pam Bondi made no such overture, but as she gathered her papers, she paused, turned toward the woman who had testified, and gave her a short nod. The kind of nod that says, "I remember, I hear you, even if I never say it out loud." As the room emptied, the cameras captured the final image. Two women, once locked in ideological war, now separated by silence, but no longer by denial. The public would spend weeks dissecting the moment, arguing over who won, but those who had truly paid attention understood the real outcome. It was not about a victor. It was about the reckoning of influence, about understanding that every public word, every televised confrontation, every memo leaked or speech delivered, had the power to echo in the lives of strangers. And on that day, on Capitol Hill, those echoes finally met their source.